Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Beyond the Framework. This is episode 5, and I'm your host, Omar Sikander with SecurityGate. I'd like to get a little more regional with the following episodes and examine laws and regulations that are impacting certain regions of the world, with the idea being that as long as you embrace the approach and some of the requirements that we've examined in previous episodes, such as from CIS, NIST CSF, and IEC 62443, you'll be better positioned to prepare for some of the enforceability that's coming down for cybersecurity. Specifically, I'd like to take a look at the US TSA directives impacting the oil and gas transportation, the rail, and the aviation industries here in the US, as well as the Australian AES CSF framework impacting the Australian energy sector, and the European NIS2 directive impacting operators of essential services. So let's talk about the TSA directives and what they have to say about patch management. Just some background on the TSA directives. From my perspective, they really gained a lot of traction after the Colonial Pipeline incident, in which Colonial's IT infrastructure was breached and resulted in operational downtime with far-reaching consequences for access to oil and gas up and down the U.S. East Coast. Originally, the Oil and Gas Pipeline Security Directive, which was version 1A, was released in 2021. And by now, there's been 3 additional iterations of that, so that we have iteration D. This also paved the way for rail and aviation to obtain their own set of directives, which borrowed a lot from the oil and gas pipeline ones. I think all 3 of them are very similar and have the same core desired outcomes. But they were released in a different manner, right? So, for example, the aviation industry, they have Emergency Amendment 23-01, which was originally released in 23. And for rail, there's a Security Directive 01A for rail specifically released in 22. These directives are legally enforceable emergency orders, according to Mr. Scott Gorton, who's the executive director of cybersecurity for the TSA. And the idea is that they want to limit or prevent logical vulnerabilities from being exploited to prevent transcendence of these issues into the kinetic world or the real world, right? With these far-reaching impacts, such as what we saw with Colonial. These directives are regulatory or mandatory instruments that essentially dictate to the operator that they must abide or do the following within a particular time period. They are enforceable, and there's regular inspections and audits that are conducted by the TSA. Alternatively, there's another mechanism that the TSA calls an information circular. Typically, these precede directives, right? So, for example, when the rail directive came about, they issued an information circular with the same requirements to the aviation industry. And then later on, the aviation industry adopted or embraced the security directives for their particular sector. These circulars are more guidelines and are not enforced, but again, and from my perspective, they seem to precede these directives. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that there were a lot of learnings from the TSA when they issued the original requirements for the pipeline sector. And the idea here was that originally they were very prescriptive, and cyber leaders within the oil and gas sector, they provided feedback, strong feedback to the TSA, suggesting that they were all about complying to these and thought that they were positive for the sector. But the way that they were written was essentially hamstringing some of the cyber leaders that had alternative or even innovative approaches to achieve the same desired business outcome or cyber outcome, but couldn't implement it just due to how prescriptive the requirement was written. So that's one of the main reasons why there have been multiple iterations of these, and I think, from what I've heard in the market, they're in a much better place with version D and the upcoming E. There are 4 major outcomes that these directives seem to have. The first is around network segmentation, which we've discussed already. The second is around access control to prevent unauthorized access to cyber critical systems. The third is around continuous detection and monitoring of anomalies. And the last is around a cohesive patch management strategy for OT environments. And these directives now ask the operators to develop an implementation plan which addresses these desired outcomes, which then the TSA and the owner or operator review together and approve it as the instrument for compliance. This is what the TSA essentially verifies and audits against to validate that improvement is actually happening. So on patch management specifically, the directive says that the owner operator must reduce the risk of exploitation of unpatched systems through the application of security patches and updates for operating systems, applications, drivers, and firmware on cyber-critical systems, consistent with that plan, right, that the owner operators created. These measures must include essentially three things: a patch management strategy. The strategy must include considerations for the risk methodology to determine the criticality of patches and updates and the implementation timeline based on this criticality and categorization, prioritization of these patches. And then the last thing is, if the owner or operator cannot provide or apply a patch to a particular system, they must elevate knowledge of what the system is and reasoning behind why they can't, along with a detailed timeline with compensating controls or alternative mitigation methods to alleviate each particular vulnerability that they find in CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. So from my perspective, many companies, regardless of what industry they're in, including these three that I'm focusing on today, they don't really patch ICS systems or don't patch them often. And the reason is ICS systems are essentially fragile in the sense that there's both legacy and disparate infrastructure, kind of cobbled together for the majority of these systems that are in play. So legacy in the sense that these systems might have technology that's decades old, which maybe wasn't able to support a patch management strategy in the modern age, as well as just the disparate nature and the complexity of some of these processes where you might deploy a patch on a particular device or set of devices within a system, and you might not necessarily know what implications these changes at the code level might have for the interactions or the interdependencies within other systems. There's also the consideration of uptime limitations for business reasons, right? Or just real reasons that you can't take a system down just because you can't take it down and take it to an unsafe state. And not all ICS systems can be tested or replicated into test environments, right? We know that there's digital twins that are, maintaining or attaining a lot of notoriety, but it's still difficult to replicate these interdependencies with both legacy and disparate systems. However, OT patch management is still possible from my perspective in an OT environment. And IEC 62443 2-3 is a great resource for one particular approach to developing a strategy and associated tactics for patching. John Kingsley and Daniel Ehrenreich, I might be mispronouncing that. They have a great YouTube video that I'll post here on how you can adopt these principles from 62443 into your own patch management strategy. But essentially, my commentary and what they have to say is there's a couple of steps here. First is information gathering. And within information gathering, you've got to understand your inventory. You can't patch what you don't know you have, right? So asset inventory, again, comes into play as a foundational requirement for a cohesive patch management approach. Supplier relationships. This is, in my opinion, single-handedly the most key aspect to your entire ICS patch strategy. There's no one better than your vendor who actually developed that particular device or implemented that particular system to help you maintain and update that system and take care of vulnerabilities as they're found out. Supportability is the equipment you're running still supported. Do they have active development of updates, right? If you're running Microsoft XP, you're probably out of luck. You probably need to consider updating, that particular operator workstation or engineering workstation that's on that OS. So things along that vein. You've got to assess your existing environment, what interdependencies exist between your critical devices or systems. You got to categorize and classify assets as the TSA prescribes, right? What is your strategy around these? What are your tactics? What's critical? What isn't? Next, monitoring and evaluation. You've got to monitor and ID patches. So the allusion to what the TSA suggests, that you check the CISA known vulnerabilities database and understand how these vulnerabilities impact your systems. You've got to determine the applicability. Are these vulnerabilities relevant to your organization, or can you skip or suggest compensating controls that would allow you to maintain that approach to your patch management? And then ultimately making a decision on whether or not you're going to apply it. Next, testing of the patch. So file authenticity is important. Is the source of the patch trusted? Is the file trusted? You've got to review what changes the patch will have in your environment and how it'll affect the system and other dependent systems. You've got to develop your installation procedure. How are you going to go and apply the patch? How are you going to go verify what the patch has affected? Qualifying and verifying the patch in a test environment is also important. You've got to develop a removal procedure. What happens if things go wrong, right? And you get some blue screen of death or a black screen. How do you revert back to your last known working condition? Next, patch deployment. Notification. Who needs to know about the patch being deployed? Who needs to be involved in deploying the patch? Preparation. What additional considerations beyond personnel need to be in place prior to deployment? Do you got to shut the line down? Do you have to shut a particular system down due to safety reasons, etc.? Scheduling. When will the patch be rolled out and tested? And finally, the actual deployment. And the last thing that 2-3 says is verification reporting. So once you actually deploy the patch, you don't see any particular issues, you might want to have some QA from production, right? Getting your personnel to provide you feedback on any changes that they might be noticing, even though you validated the patch was deployed successfully. You got to train your personnel on any particular changes or how things might be affected now that you've deployed this particular patch. And you've got to document it as well, right? Management of change is important. So if you follow these steps as per 2-3, probably a very good way to embrace or start embracing patch management and allow you to be compliant with the requirements as per the TSA directives. Hope you found this really helpful. And next time we'll be examining, again, the AES-CSF regulation within Australia. And catch me on the next one. Thanks, everybody.